everybody, welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I'm Orrin Phillips, and first I wanted to give a big shout out to our sponsor, TwoMorrows Publishing. I just got my first issue of Back Issue magazine. I subscribed recently. I am so excited for it. This month is all about Daredevil. If you love Daredevil, please go to your LCS or go to TwoMorrows.com. Get this issue, get all the issues, and check out the new books they have coming out too. It's a wonderful array of things. You're going to love it. Okay, so who's on the show this week? Well, one of the best ever when it comes to horror comics. And I'd even say, as far as art in general, I'm talking about Stephen Bissette. Known best for his work with Alan Moore on Swamp Thing. He has done a variety of projects, but fans absolutely love his work. And it's very easy to understand why, because when you see it, the detail and the emotion that comes through it is absolutely incredible. If you haven't seen his work, please check it out. He has his own website. We talk all about his career, how he got into comics, his process, and so many other things. So, without further ado, here is Mr. Stephen Bissette. To have artist Stephen Bissette joining me. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for the invite, Orrin. I appreciate it.
So, first question we ask everyone is, how did you discover comics?
I was born in 1955, so I grew up right in the boom of the Silver Age of comics. They were everywhere. I mean, I grew up in northern Vermont. My first 4 years or so of life was in a community, Essex Junction, Vermont, where we were in walking distance from a little shop on the railroad tracks, Tip Top, that had a comic book spinner rack. So, comics were available to me. I have an older brother, Rick. Because he was older, he had stacks of comic books. His best friends in the neighborhood, the Stearnses, they had even better comic books because, the other guys always have the better comic books. And then we moved to Duxbury, a very rural part of Vermont, spelled Duxbury. It is not a Karl Barks village, although there was a lot of Karl Barks comics being read there. And even growing up in rural Vermont, as I got older, I could get on my bicycle and there were 2 or 3 places I could find comic books. Comic books were readily available, late 50s and throughout the 60s. And once I had my driver's license, age 16, in 1971, comics are what I would pick up if I was going out to the drive-in that night. I'd stop at a general store, pick up some snacks, something to drink, and some comic books to read until the drive-in got dark enough that the movie would start. So comics were everywhere. I was even fortunate, Orrin, in that we were in kind of a hippie pocket, up in northern Vermont. And I was a really straight kid, military family. But that meant that underground comics were available very early on. And so I could drive to Burlington, Vermont, which was our big town, and there were 2 shops, a bookstore on Church Street called The Little Professor, and a head shop called the Land of Oz. Mm-hmm. And I could buy brand new underground comics there, which led me to Bud Plant's mailing list, and that's when I began to discover, being able to, through the mail, get underground comics and fanzines.
Mm-hmm. How big a shock was it for you to see what underground comics was compared to the DC Marvel stuff?
It changed the world. I'm not exaggerating. It completely changed the world for me. You grow up as a kid and you drink in media. I see my grandkids doing it now. I have grandkids who, are ages 18 down to 6 months. And, the media environment they're growing in is just super saturating. And when you're a kid, you just kind of drink it in, and you gradually figure out, oh, people do this. It's like people make this. And still, though, I was wearing those blinders of presuming that what was available in 4-color comic books that I could buy on the newsstand, and the most transgressive of all at that time, the black and white comic magazines. Not just the Warren and Erie publication stuff I loved, but also Big Daddy Roth, cartoons and surf tunes. You thought that was it. You thought that's all that was possible in the media. And I kept my own sketchbooks by the time I was in junior high, and they were weird. It was weird, weird shit. And I was shaped as much by monster magazines as comic books in what I drew. And my art teacher, William Cathy, in eighth grade, I think is when I had Bill. He saw my sketchbooks one day. He asked permission. I said, sure. And he looked through them. And then about a week or two later, he brought me a copy of Zap.
Okay.
And he said, you can't tell anybody where you got this. Like, I could lose my job, but you need to see this. And it was Zap number 0.
Okay.
And Meatball was the first thing I read. And, Underground Comics were my meatball. I got hit by the Robert Crumb meatball and everything changed. And that's when I realized anything I could imagine, if I had the skill to put it down on paper, I had license to draw. So Underground's really changed everything. And around the same time, around the same time, or maybe a year later, I also discovered underground cinema.
Okay.
And films like Performance, the Donald Cammell, Nicholas Roeg, Mick Jagger movie Performance.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the same realization at that point about cinema, about media, which also changed how I looked at television. Once you read an underground comic, you realize how laundered a lot of what was available on the spinner racks was. And once I began to actually not just read about, but go and see underground films, I realized how fettered television was, and the movies I loved were. And that was all life-changing. And it all started with reading, Zap number 0.
So where does the decision come to get into the business yourself?
Wow, that's a great question. I had been drawing my own little mini comics, and we didn't have photocopiers back there. So, we meaning my next door neighbor, Mitch Casey, when I was a little guy, and we used to draw these little like hand-drawn comics, and that was the only copy you had because, it was the one and only. But Mitch was the first person I ever saw draw a comic. And that's when I realized, oh, I could do that. And Mitch, being a year and a half older than me, he was better than me. Mm-hmm. And that made me push myself. But I didn't really think about trying to enter the profession until 3 things happened. Number 1, I read Skull number 6, mm-hmm. which was the last issue of the underground comic Skull. Okay. And it was the first comic I'd ever read that actually physically terrified me. Like, I dropped the comic on the ground. I turned a page and I dropped the comic on the ground. And my first thought was, I want to do that. Like, I want to make comics that would be that strong. The second thing, which is sad, is my best friend in high school committed suicide. Oh, and I bring that up not trying to pluck heartstrings, but because when you're a teenager, you kind of think you're immortal. You think you got all the time in the world, and that trauma made me realize that I now had time that my best friend no longer had, and I better pursue what I really want to do in whatever life was left me. And the third thing was my parents bought a sight unseen property in Florida, down in what became Northport, Florida. And they were going to move. And my dad had the idea in his head that I was going to marry, my girlfriend, quote unquote, in town. And I was going to take over the family store. And that led to the fateful conversation of, no, Dad, I want to draw comics. And that sounded nuts to my dad. That was like, here I was turning down a sure thing, a family grocery store that had clothed and fed us for, a decade or more. And I was saying no to that to pursue this crazy, insane sounding dream. And that didn't change for my dad until the second he met Joe Kubert. My dad insisted on driving me to the interview for the Kubert School, and it was Joe who interviewed us. It was Joe and Muriel Kubert that ran the school. They were there in person every day that the school was operational. And the second my dad shook hands with Joe, it was okay that I wanted to do this, because Joe, had been in the military, had this big family, a lot of kids, had raised them based on what he had earned as a freelancer all his life. And Joe was a man's man. And, to my father, who served in 4 branches of the service, that was the first time he probably even thought of strong men, having any role in the comic book industry. And Joe and my dad bonded, and from that second on, it was okay with my dad that I was going to do this. But that was after 21 years of struggle,
Yeah.
So those were the 3 steps. They were big. They were momentous, and it was weird because I didn't have a lot of friends my age that seemed to be driven as to what they wanted to do. Again, we were teenagers. What do we know? And that really changed for me with that big, bite on the ass of mortality. I had lost other friends in high school, car accidents, that kind of thing. But when a close friend chooses to deal themselves out, that's when it became really life and death for me. Like, I got to do this. I knew even in my youth, if I didn't do it, Oren, I would regret it later in life. If I didn't try, I would regret it for the rest of my life. So I just decided, this is what I'm going to try to do. And I didn't know how to go about it. There was no place to go do it at the time. This would have been, 73, 74. So the Kubert School hadn't opened yet. I wasn't aware of places like SVA. When I was looking for colleges, I went down to the Rhode Island School of Design with my crude portfolio, such as it was, and they frowned on the comics thing. It was funny. They said, I shouldn't say they, whoever interviewed me said, oh, we had a guy who did this. And I knew it was Walt Simonson they were talking about because I was reading Walt Simonson's comics, right?
Yeah.
So even then, they were turning me away, saying, no, RISD isn't for you. But I knew that one of my heroes had been through that program. So it was like, well, you guys don't even know what you've done, So, but still, there was nowhere to go at the time.
Right. How did your art evolve from day one at the Kubert School to your last day there?
Well, the big evolutionary gestalt was Joe putting a Winsor Newton Series 7 watercolor brush in my hand, and for the first time discovering the right brush for cartooning with. And Joe came and looked over my shoulder like an hour or two later, and I remember him sort of chuckling, saying, you're taking to this like a duck to water. And it was true. It was like being handed, my grandkids are into the Harry Potter world. It was like being handed my wand. Here's your magic wand, Steve. So that was the big gestalt. Prior to that, Oren, I mean, I had drawn a complete published comic before I went to Kubert School. I did 2 years at Johnson State College in northern Vermont, in Johnson, Vermont, and my second year there, a close friend of mine who I'm still good friends with, Tim Varick, we called him Doc Ersatz, or he called himself Doc Ersatz, I should say. He also saw my sketchbooks, and he said, Steve, if you want to do a comic book, I'll pay for the print run. And, this is 1975, 76. So $200 got you 200 copies, Oren, of a little, a magazine size, full comic at the local Johnson Press, which was on the campus. So I had already drawn one full comic story. It was called Not Yeti, and my late friend Steve Perry had written it. So I was working from a script, and I knew that was a big step into my illusion of professionalism was, right. You work with a writer. And I also had a couple of original pieces in that comic that I wrote and drew, but they were short, 2 pages, 3 pages. But I had done it, I had only drawn with ballpoint pen and with pilot markers, which were these fine point markers that were sold, in office supply stores and so on at that time. So I had drawn the whole comic with pilot markers, these little fine line markers. I didn't know how to use a brush. Whenever I tried to work with a brush, the art classes were all geared for fine art. And so it was those big broad brushes, and you can draw with those, right. I couldn't even figure out how to do calligraphy with it. So Joe putting the brush in my hand was the big evolution. And then, I mean, once I was at Keyword School, I'd finally found my home. We were all there to do the same thing. We woke up in the morning, we ate, drank, shit, and dreamt comics nonstop, 24 hours, 7 days a week. And you couldn't help but get better because you were constantly producing. It was a hard workload at the school. I mean, Joe was a pretty stern taskmaster, and we had an extraordinary faculty. Dick Giordano teaching inking. Rick Estrada was one of our teachers. Lee Elias was one of our teachers. It was an amazing program, and these guys were industry veterans. They didn't mince words. My little meaningless, pen marks and cross hatching, Lee Elias would call it chicken scratch. Bissette, quit doing that chicken scratch. And you only have to hear that once or twice before you go, oh, I better I better really think about what these marks are I'm putting down. We had a work program, Oren, that if you were on top of your assignments, paying work was available. It didn't pay a lot, but it was paying work that Joe brought in, and it was the beginning of what became his telegraphics studio. And we were doing work that was going to see print. We were taking photostats of DC comic pages from the Golden Age and Silver Age and reformatting them, cut and paste, and redrawing where necessary to make those paperbacks that New American Library put out of Superman and Superboy and Green Lantern and so on. We were reformatting artwork, again, from the DC photostat archives for educational comics, where they were being relettered, uppercase, lowercase, correct grammar. And that's where I first met the Floronic Man. That's the first time I ever saw Jason Woodrow, a character I'd be drawing in a few years.
Yeah.
And we were also doing battle albums, which were one-page or double-page spreads that would appear in the back of Sergeant Rock, which was the comic Joe was editing still up in DC. And Rick Veitch and I collaborated on our first 4-color comic book story, which was called A Song for Saigon Sally. And it also appeared in the back of a Sergeant Rock somewhere in the early 300s in the numbering of the... And then we began, Joe was happy with the job Rick and I had done. And so Rick and I began getting solo jobs from Joe, always working from scripts that Joe had already bought. So we were working with professional writers. Bob, you work from a Bob Kanigher script, you learn a lot, believe me. And Joe would go over every single page. You would prepare your thumbnails. Joe would go over them with you. You'd prepare your tracing paper or your rough pencils. Joe would go over them with you, and it was incredible what we learned. Myself, my classmates, Rick Veitch, Tom Yates, Ron Zalmi, Kara Sherman Torino, all of us that worked on that material. Any job you did that Joe was going over, you just soaked up all you could from it because the master was showing you a way to do better comics.
What kind of scripts do you like most? Sort of looser scripts or ones that are a little more detailed?
I like scripts, right? I worked at Marvel for a number of years where it was Marvel method, where you got a plot outline, a page and a half that you'd have to turn into 8 or 16 pages. I adapted a Ron Gillard story into the shop for Bizarre Adventures. And I was just handed a photocopy of the Ron Gillard story and told by the editor, Rick Marshall, turn this into 16 pages of comics. You're writing, right? That's right. Make no mistake about where I fall in the Marvel method. If you're working Marvel method, the penciler is doing at least half of the job, if not more, of the writer. And then the dialogue is affixed after over your work. So I prefer working from scripts, Oren, and I'm not being a wise ass saying that. Full scripts. I'm working from a template that a writer has thought through how to approach the page. Now, to answer your question properly, I have worked with very spare scripts. I mean, there is no sparer script than a Bob Kanigher or a Joe Kubert script. There's no fat on those. Panel descriptions are a sentence or two. The only other text on there is what's going to be on the page. And then Joe cuts that down further, right? If the images tell the story, you don't need the additional dialogue or captions. But I've also worked from Alan Moore scripts, which were bar none the best scripts I ever worked from in my entire life. I've worked from scripts by Bob and Jane Stein, Bob Stein, better known as R.L. Stein. And Bob and Jane would give me scripts that were actually comic pages with stick figures on them and the word balloons and captions lettered in pencil. Yeah. And those were fun to work from. It's just I knew, okay, I'm they've drawn a mummy. I've got to make it look like a really great mummy. But I did follow their scripts. Alan Moore scripts are probably my favorite, not only because I think we all collaboratively did some of the best work any of us ever had a hand in, but also because I learned so much working from Alan. Rick Veitch and I had been talking, the day Rick and I met, September of or late August of '76, we became fast friends. And right from our first conversation, we both had this vision of what comics could be, but we weren't good enough writers to get there. And when I read my first Alan Moore script, which was Saga of the Swamp Thing number 21, the anatomy lesson, it was as revelatory as Zap number 0. Alan was a master, and he bottled up in like 22 or 23 pages of script the most perfect comic book script I'd ever read in my life. It fired on all cylinders. It was layered. It was textured. The characters were vivid, and it was fully circular. It began and ended at the same reference point, and it was just a perfectly crafted script. It also fulfilled everything Rick and I had been dreaming of for, at that point, 6 years, or more. And it also did everything I thought cinema should do, but it did it in comics. And it turned out, as Alan and I were corresponding, this is pre-internet, we couldn't afford to call each other on the phone yet. We were exchanging voluminous letters. John Toddleben up in Erie, Pennsylvania, who I was collaborating on the artwork with, Alan Moore in Northampton, England, myself in Wilmington, Vermont, we were sending long letters to one another. They would cross in the mail, and we all found we wanted to do the exact same thing with the book. And what Alan and I shared in common, among a number of things, were we both loved certain filmmakers. And that first script was like a perfect Nicholas Roeg film. And Nicholas Roeg at that time was one of my favorite filmmakers. Big Performance, Walkabout, The Man Who Fell to Earth, Don't Look Now, one of the best horror movies ever made. And Alan had it all happening in one issue of Swamp Thing. So those are my favorite scripts to work from. I've only ever seen, I got to draw once from a Neil Gaiman script, the story Jack and the Green. And Neil is just as consummate, a writer. And so that was also a fun script to work from. But I really got to explore what was possible in those years collaborating with Alan and John and Rick on Swamp Thing. It was an amazing team. Len Wein as our editor. I mean, when you're working under the man who co-created the character you're drawing, and he says go with it, then you've got the blessing of one of the two creators. And later I got to meet and know a bit Bernie Wrightson, and Bernie was wonderful. And Bernie also enjoyed what we had been doing. And the team that not only was John Toddleben, Rick Veitch, myself, but also John Costanza on the letters, Tatiana Wood with the coloring. It was a really amazing chemistry. And once Karen Berger stepped in, Len Wein left the book with issue 24. Karen began editing with issue 25. And Karen was one of the 3 or 4 best editors I ever had the good fortune to work with. And so, being part of that creative chemistry is also what makes me say that those scripts are my favorite, because it was the total experience, Oren, that I'm talking about.
Now, did DC approach you and say, hey, would you like to be on this book? Or did you pitch them and say, hey, I think I'd be a good fit for Swamp Thing.
No, it was our classmate Tom Yates. Tom Yates was the original artist on the relaunch of Swamp Thing. It was the comic called Saga of the Swamp Thing, and DC relaunched it right on the heels of the Wes Craven theatrical film Swamp Thing. And Tom and I we were both odd ducks at Kubert School because we were both in love with sort of dead genres. You know, when we went to the Kubert School, Tom only wanted to do adventure comics. And there were no adventure comics, right? I mean, in the mid 70s, it was superheroes everywhere. I only wanted to do horror comics. There were no horror comics, you know, and those things that were being published called horror comics, those sad, you know, flimsy, sappy mystery comics just never did it for me. And the underground era was over. You know, during my time at the Kubert School was the death knell of the underground. So Tom and I were in love with dead genres. Tom took on the art chores on Swamp Thing, thinking, "Oh, Swamp Thing's in Louisiana. That's you know, it's a swamp. It's kind of like a jungle. This will be as close as I get to doing Tarzan." And the late great Marty Pasco, and I do miss Marty. Whatever his strengths or weaknesses as a writer, you know, one of the first things he did was take Swamp Thing out of the swamp. So Tom didn't even get to have that fun on the book. And it was Tom who approached not just me, but John Tollivan and I. And he said, "I'm going to leave the book. You guys know the book." John had been assisting Tom on the art chores since issue 2. Rick Veitch had been assisting Tom Yates on the art chores since about the same time. And I started pitching in around issue 8. I laid out a couple of issues. And that's because Tom had monthly deadlines and he was penciling and inking. I mean, it was just an impossible work regimen that he was under. So when Tom decided he was leaving, he asked John and I, "Do you guys want to try out? I think you guys would be great." Now, bear in mind, Oren, Tom, I mean, we shared a house for a number of years in New Jersey. Tom Yates, Rick Veitch, John Tollivan, and myself. So Tom had seen like every drawing that had been done in that house. We all had seen each other's work. And Tom had seen when John and I would jam on something, and we would just do it for fun. Occasionally we'd each pitch in. If somebody had a tight deadline, you know, then the whole house would get behind it. We all had our own drawing tablet, our own drawing tables and so on. So Tom was the one that kind of put us together as a team in his head. The other person that facilitated it was another of our classmates, Tim Truman. And Tim Truman started at the Kubert School, I think 2 years after Rick and I started there. But we were all friends with Tim and his wife, Beth. You know, they were a sane married couple in the monastic life many of us lived at the Kubert School. And Tim was the one who put together a Dungeon and Dragon work gig. And I'm excited about going to see the movie this week, by the way. And so by day, we were in this Holiday Inn in Hopatcong, New Jersey, working in a sweatshop Tim Truman supervised, designing toy figures for TSR, Dungeon and Dragons. And at night, John and I would go back to our respective rooms, or one of the 2 rooms, and we jammed on our sample pages. And we did 2 sets. We did a set, I think it was a 2-page comic narrative we each did, that we just made up. You know, we didn't recreate pages from a published issue. We just made up a sequence with this, you know, with some characters that a character John had called Nuke Face and this kind of giant mutant frog that I cooked up. And I penciled the set that John inked, and John penciled the set that I inked. And then we did some character portraits of characters from Len and Bernie's run on the first 10 issues of Swamp Thing. We did some big full-page character likenesses. And that's what Tom brought in and hand-delivered to Len Wein. And we only later found out, you know, other artists who were vying for the spot, either earlier in the Swamp Thing run or concurrent with us, you know, Dave Gibbons, Art Soydum, you know, there were some other people trying out. But Len liked what he saw. Len also knew that we'd all been assisting Tom, so he knew we would be familiar with Marty Pasco's scripts because we'd worked from them. And Len said, right, Steve, you've got the stronger storytelling chops, which at that time was true. It wasn't true a couple of years later. And you have the better sense of page design. You're the penciler. John, you have the better ink line. Your inks look fabulous on Steve's pencils. You're the inker. And that was how we got the gig. But it was really thanks to Tom Yates, that it was Tom that asked it.
What were your thoughts on the character, and what did you want to bring to the character that might not have been there before?
I didn't have a lot of thoughts about Swamp Thing. John Totleben did. John Totleben started at Kubert School the year after Rick and I did. So when we were it was a 2-year program. When we were in our senior year, our second year, John was in his first year, and we all it was a small, there were 17 of us in our class. There were 20 or 21 in John's class, but we were all close friends. Mm-hmm. John, right from the minute we met him, was clearly an artistic genius. He could draw circles around all of us, heavily influenced by Bernie Wrightson, but also heavily influenced by Virgil Finlay, the pulp science fiction artist, heavily influenced by Franklin Booth, one of the great pen and ink artists. And it was Franklin Booth who invented the pen and ink drawing style that Bernie Wrightson built on. So John was so into artwork, and had very fortunately been in a very high level, like a college level illustration and art program during his high school years in Erie, Pennsylvania. So he came to the Kubert School with a much higher level of art education than any of us, except our classmate Ben Ruiz, who had been part of the Art Students League and so on. And John was the one who had Swamp Thing ideas. He loved Swamp Thing. I like Swamp Thing, right? But I was more in love with Skull Comics. I was more in love with Greg Irons' work in the Undergrounds. And I was more in love with out of all the comic book characters that were in the horror genre available at that time, Jack Kirby's The Demon, and the Marv Wolfman, Gene Colan, Tom Palmer run on Tomb of Dracula. Those were the comics I loved as much as John loved Swamp Thing.
Right.
Now, because of John's love for Swamp Thing, we're all partying at night, after hours at the school, a couple of bowls, a couple of beers, and John would start brainstorming about Swamp Thing, and Rick and I would pitch in. It's Rick who had the idea one night about, hallucinogenic potatoes growing off of Swamp Thing's bag. Right. No, I'm sorry. John had the idea of the potatoes growing off of Swamp Thing's back, tubers, he called them. And then Rick went, oh, but they're like peyote, right? They're hallucinogenic. That was like a party conversation one night, right? Before any of us were anywhere near the character. When you're a cartoonist, you keep sketchbooks, you keep all those ideas in your head. And John was the one who, early on in Tom Yates' run, John did this drawing of Swamp Thing where his eyes looked like pained, and he was completely overgrown with lichen and ferns and so on. Because John's idea was he should not be a man trapped in a monster's body. He should be a new being. He is a plant being. There is no person in there, right? The wish to become Alec Holland is just a delusion. Tom showed that drawing to Len Wein, and Len said it's too radical. Len, and this is early in the run of Saga of Swamp Thing, somewhere in there. Then when we're working on Swamp Thing, if you go back, Oren, and look at the issues we did with Marty Pasco, we were still drawing that kind of conservative take on Swamp Thing that had been codified, right? It was Len's character, so you drew Len's character the way Len wanted his character drawn, right? And Len invited Alan Moore in, right? Marty was making a better living writing Saturday morning animated cartoons. And for that and whatever other reasons, he alerted Len that he was going to leave Swamp Thing. So Len had to find a writer. And the minute he brought in Alan Moore, it turned out Alan wanted to do exactly what John had been talking about for 5 years or more. And it just all clicked. And for whatever reason, Len gave Alan, and by proxy, John and I, the license he had not given years before when Tom Yates showed Len that original drawing that John had done. Alan created a new origin for the character, and maybe that was the switch where Len went, okay, all bets are off, go nuts, and we did.
As a talent, when there is a sea change like that, a known writer leaves, a new person comes in, what's going through your mind as to, I guess, the security of the book and the security of your job on the book?
There is no security in comics, Thor. Okay, get that right out of your head. Let's dispel that instantly. I'd grown up reading comics, so I knew there was no security in comics. Okay, if Jack Kirby can lead Fantastic Four, if Steve Ditko, even more momentous for me. I mean, the point where I kind of gave up on Marvel Comics as a kid was when Ditko left Spider-Man. I left Spider-Man. I loved John Romita's work, but it wasn't the comic I loved. It wasn't the character Peter Parker anymore. He suddenly became this cocky college kid, and that wasn't Peter Parker,
Right.
So I learned early on that despite the happy-go-lucky tenor of the editorial pages in the Marvel comics, something else is going on here. And once we were at Kubert School, I mean, not only were we soaking up everything we could learn about storytelling, drawing, and so on, we were learning hard life lessons. I mean, when not one but two of your instructors who you love and respect and look up to show up to teach, and their eyes are puffy red because they cried on the train all the way in because they got fired or their spouse got fired. Kelly Harris was our pastebook and mechanicals teacher. Jack Harris her husband got fired at DC during the implosion or just before the implosion. When your instructors are showing up and you're seeing real life flesh and blood consequences of work being cut off, you don't graduate from that school having any more delusions about job security. But to answer your question, as a reader, the Marvel comics I loved when I was in college were writer driven, Master Kung Fu. I love Paul Gulacy's issues. I still have them in my collection. But it was Doug Mensch who was the anchor of that book, right? It was Jim Starlin creating the character, and Doug Mensch became the writer, and it was Doug's scripts that propelled that. I could make it through a badly drawn issue of Master Kung Fu because it was still being scripted by Doug. And it still had that anchor. Same with other books I really enjoyed at the time. Black Panther, the run that Billy Graham was the cartoonist on, the whole Jungle Action run. It was Don McGregor's scripting that really propelled those books for good and ill. I mean, Doug Mensch could be a very terse writer. Don can be very, very prose heavy, but still, it was the writing that propelled the books. And I know a lot of people ridicule, especially the late phase of Jack Kirby's work, but Jack Kirby's Fourth World series at DC, that was another life lesson in how insecure everything is. Here's Kirby building the one of the greatest modern myths I had ever experienced in any media, right? It was better than Star Trek. It was better than, any movie series I'd ever seen or experienced. And it got cut right off at the heels. And I was into those books. I still think they're brilliant. And he was writing and drawing, and I didn't care about his writing style seeming ham-fisted at times because they read as true and the emotion was always there. And clearly this was a man who had thought through all these levels, all these planes of this story that was gradually unfolding issue by issue in 4 different books. So when I'm suddenly on the other side of the equation, right, I'm now stepping in on Swamp Thing. I came in with full respect and knowledge of the importance of the writer's role, that they were the anchor on the book, but that I also had to give it my absolute all as an artist, not just to prove myself as a commercial artist and keep working, but also because I really believed in the medium of comics. I love comics. And we had also just had an incredible lesson, Oren, in Frank Miller's run on Daredevil, right? We had seen a character that nobody had cared about. I mean, I grew up with the original run of Daredevil, and there were certain issues I loved. You know, Wally Wood's short run. I always liked Gene Colan's artwork. I love a lot of Gene's artwork, but Daredevil just never really worked for me. And then Frank, you know, Frank comes in. Frank's younger than me, right? Frank was like a kid that showed up at Kubert School one weekend. I wasn't there when he was there, but my classmates, Rick Beach and others, hung out with Frank for a few hours when he was hoping to break into comics, and he
Wow.
stopped by the school.
Yeah.
So I knew, you know, I hadn't met Frank yet, but I knew who he was. And it's funny, later when Frank and I met finally at a Mid-Ohio convention in the early 80s, we grew up 15 miles apart from each other.
Wow.
Right? I went to Howard Union High School in Duxbury, Vermont. Frank went to one of the Montpelier schools, Union 32. But we weren't in bands and we weren't in sports. And that was the only way you met other kids from other schools at that time. You certainly didn't meet other cartoonists, right? But anyway, point being, I felt this connection with what Frank had done with the Daredevil comic as a reader, right? I still have the run in those white boxes behind me of Frank's run on Daredevil, right from his first issue as penciler when he was working with another writer. And Frank showed us how it was done, right? Like we had that example before us. That's why I bring it up. And we were conscious of it, right? We were also conscious, we meaning John Tollivan, Rick Beach, and I, we had been buying Warrior magazine from its first issue, right? Warrior was a black and white comic magazine from England. Des Skin was the publisher. It was an experiment in making comics in the UK. And from issue 1, which we bought at Heroes World, the local comic shop in New Jersey by the Kubert School, within driving distance of the Kubert School, Alan Moore, working with Gary Leach originally, was reinventing Marvel Man, a character we'd never heard of. But we recognized, oh, this is Captain Marvel, right? Once they started doing the backstory, and we recognized, you know, the villain of Marvel Man was a different version of the villain from the old Golden Age Captain Marvel. So that gave us 2 current examples, right? Frank showing us how it's done under the radar when you get to work on a book that nobody at the publishing house is paying attention to. Like Frank got away with a lot. And then the sales pick up and they start to pay attention at the editorial and publishing level. Frank showed us how it was done. Alan, who we were now going to be working with, had already shown us how it was done as we were reading Warrior. And this was our shot. And we went in knowing, oh, okay, we can do something here with this. Like we're not tied by the failed legacy of DC not knowing to do what to do with Swamp Thing for ever since the end of issue 10. And we also knew that we were under the radar because we were told, one of us was told, I think John was the one told at one point by Len Wein, that the book was near cancellation. It was only selling, I think, 16,000 copies. And that's when it was a newsstand comic, Oren. And I'm surprised it lasted long enough for us to do anything. But we took that as a positive, like, oh, then we can't fuck it up.
Because no one's
it's
watching.
Gonna die, you know, it's gonna die anyway. So let's give it our best. And that kind of meant we were left alone for the first year and a half. I mean, Karen Berger was a great editor, and Karen could have a stern hand. Alan turned in a completed script that Karen said no to. She said, "This is too slow. We'll use the script, but we'll use it later in the run." It was the pacing was too funereal, I think was her term. And Alan wrote overnight, in a matter of a day and a half, 2 days, from scratch, the script that lost us the comics code, Swamp Thing number 29, Love and Death. And that was like a rabbit that Alan pulled out of his hat. And as soon as I got the script, this is when my dream kicked in, Oren. When you asked what we wanted to do before, this is when I went, oh, now this is a horror comic, right? And this is what I've been aching to do since the minute I read Skull number 6. And that script was my shot at Skull number 6.
So what's the first change you made to the character? Now that gloves are off, it's the horror comic, no one's watching. In your thought process, what do you want to start to change? What do you want your art to start to look like?
Okay, for me personally, or for us as a team?
For you personally.
Well, for me personally, it meant it was a monster comic,
Mhm.
right from the get go. It was a monster comic, and I love monster comics. I love monster movies. I love monster everything. Secondly, it was a horror comic,
Mhm.
but it wasn't there yet, and there were these pesky superheroes in the way, right? The Justice League and all this crap. Um, in fact, I was so. This is how against the superheroes I was, Orion, personally. Um, Len and Alan, and I was later told this by each of them individually. I heard the same account two different
Mhm.
ways. Um, they knew I was going to object to the Justice League appearing. In
Mhm.
fact, I didn't pencil a lot of those pages. I called up Rick Veach. Rick drove down to my studio and he penciled, 3 or 4 of those Justice League pages in Swamp Thing 24 because I was pissed. I was like, what is this crap? And so the fiction I was presented was, oh, Len insisted that they be in the book, right?
Mhm.
And Len's my boss, so okay, what Len says goes. It was
Mhm.
really Alan that wanted the Justice League in the book, but Alan knew me well enough by then to know, okay, I don't want to get on Steve's wrong side. So so it was between the two of them, or Len just said, I'll just tell him I did it. And so it was a horror comic. So
Mhm.
what changes did I want to make? I wanted to make, Swamp Thing was a plant. He's not a man anymore.
Mhm.
And we were all using the same language. Alan Moore, John Tollivan, Rick Beach, myself. We all saw him as a plant elemental.
Mhm.
And I was rooted enough in folklore and mythology. I've been reading books on folklore and mythology since I was 4 and 5 and 6 years old. So I knew about the Green Man. So to me, Swamp Thing was the Green Man. To Alan, Swamp Thing was the Green Man, that Celtic figure that appears in architecture, in sculpture and so on. This fertility figure of this man being that's a plant, vines growing out of his mouth, and head of leaves instead of hair, and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So I really saw him, that being his primal essence. And if there's any through line in the work I've done in comics over the decades, or in that I could point to that you could recognize, is whenever I've had a shot to work on a character, if it's one issue or if it's one story, I try to get to what's the primal core of this character. And if it's something I'm writing and drawing, that's really where I go. When I got invited by Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman to start contributing turtle stories to anthology comics like Turtle Soup, go
Mhm.
back and look at the story Shell Shock that I wrote and drew. And it's
Mhm.
really about, I wanted to understand what was the primal bond between Splinter and these immature turtle mutants, right? And that's what the story's about. It's about what is that bond between those characters. And that's where I went with Swamp Thing. That's what I wanted to do with Swamp Thing. I wanted to get to the primal essence. What does it mean to be a plant elemental? What does the world look, smell, taste like if you're a plant elemental? And again, that's exactly what Alan wanted. And that's
Mhm.
where Alan went. And so any ideas any of us brought to the table, Alan embraced them and one upped them. He always was open to our ideas. And when you saw his expression of the idea, it was better than what you had brought to the table.
Right.
So it was like throwing gas on a fire. We just like really ran with it. In terms of how it affected my artwork, one of my frustrations with Tom Yates's run with Marty Pasco on the series before we came on
Mhm.
is I shared Tom's disappointment in pulling the character out of the swamp, because Tom's drawing Prince Valiant right now. The
Right.
Sunday Prince Valiant that Mark Schultz,
Mhm.
a mutual friend of ours, is writing. And Mark and Tom are doing just a fantastic job. Tom brings to life the environments of his adventure comics. And it's funny how I've gotten to do what I wanted to do in horror comics. Tom has ended up being able to do almost every adventure character he loved. I mean, he's done Tarzan, he's done Zorro, he's done the Lone Ranger, he's doing Prince Valiant. This is Tom's, life work. And Tom always brings the environment to life. And he didn't get to do that with Swamp Thing, because Swamp Thing would be in a box in a train car. Swamp Thing would be in the back of a pickup truck. Swamp Thing would be in an airplane. It was like there was no connection with the environment. So for me as an artist, and John Totleben was in exactly the same place I was about this. We wanted the environment, that swamp, to be a living, breathing place. And if you look back at our run on Swamp Thing, whenever it's appropriate and not distracting from storytelling, there are animals, there are insects, there is plant life everywhere. I grew up with the Silver Age Aquaman comics, but I also grew up with the 1960s Jacques Cousteau TV specials about the ocean. And it always bothered me that Submariner and Aquaman lived in these sterile ocean environments. Fish would appear when they needed them for the story, but it didn't look or feel at all like the ocean we would see for an hour on a National Geographic special about Jacques Cousteau. And that's what I wanted to do with Swamp Thing. I wanted that environment to be the external expression of everything Swamp Thing was, is, could be, and that the swamp was the full expression of everything Swamp Thing could be. And to me, they were one. One of the lessons I would bring to my students, I taught for 15 years at the Center for Cartoon Studies. I just retired in 2020, not because of COVID, but because I turned 65 and I want to write and draw and do other things for a few years before I go. And I would present a story to my students that I had written and drawn. It's a ghost story that I wrote and drew. And I would ask my students how many characters are in the story. And there is only 3 human beings in the story. But the story also revolves around a dresser, a piece of furniture, and darkness. And I would coax out of the students identifying the object and the environment as being characters. Because when you're cartooning, if you're not aware of everything about the environment being a character and everything, including the elements, darkness, light, fire, water, being characters, then you are not going to use every toolkit that you have as an artist to tell that story. And particularly if it's a story that revolves around any of those elements, those elements need to be graphically as fully expressed and as strongly felt by the reader as your human protagonist or your elemental protagonist in the case of Swamp Thing. So to me, all of this was part of really doing the job as a storyteller.
As this book goes on, it becomes very successful. In your mind, does the success of this book tell you made the right decision to get into comics, that you belong, or did you feel that way prior to the book sort of taking off?
I knew I belonged the first day I showed up at the campus at the Kubert School.
Gotcha.
I mean, it was that simple, Oren. When I got there to Dover, New Jersey, originally the campus is where it's a dorm now. The Baker Mansion is now a dorm for the current incarnation of the Kubert School. But when we were there, that was the classrooms were in the Baker Mansion. We lived in the carriage house that adjoined it. I knew I was. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, once Swamp Thing began to, at some point, we never saw sales figures. DC's royalty plan didn't kick in until such a high threshold. Swamp Thing never got to that threshold, so we never saw sales figures. But at some point, Len Wein or Karen, I think it was Karen, told us, it had gone up around 60,000. Now we had gone from 16 to 60,000, so we knew, okay, we're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
But we also knew, this isn't to twist your question, but, I vividly remember the night that John Totleben said on the phone to me, we put this car on the road and they want us in the back seat now. There was a point when we knew we weren't driving the Swamp Thing mobile anymore, right? It was now the editorial decisions like Crisis on Infinite Earths, right, interrupting whatever we were doing because there had to be a crisis issue and so on. It was starting to not be fun. And it was always hard work. But that didn't make me doubt that we'd done the right thing. In fact, if you remember my chronology at all, I went from Swamp Thing to Taboo, which in fact John Tolliban and I were working on before we stepped off of Swamp Thing. We were working on Taboo. And that was because Dave Sim had come to us at Mid-Ohio Con, the same convention I first met Frank Miller at, is where I first met Dave Sim. And Dave loved what we were doing at Swamp Thing. Dave had it in his head that as a team, Alan, John, and I should leave DC and just do our own Swamp Thing comic, self-publish it. That was what Dave was thinking. He said so. I'm not speculating. He said that in so many words. And John and I came back with, well, if you really want to bankroll whatever we want to do, we want to do the Ultimate Horror Anthology comic, right? Because nobody's doing horror right now.
Right.
Nobody is doing a proper horror anthology. And Dave, kind of swallowed and bit his lip and said, okay. And so I went from feeling so much like we were doing the right thing on Swamp Thing when it was really cooking, that I shifted gears into, okay, now how do I push the horror genre completely into the 80s and 90s in ways we weren't able to do in Swamp Thing. And part of the impetus is that you got to understand, Oren, in the early 80s, horror was big, right? I love horror, and horror was big. I could go almost every week and see a new horror movie. And, a third of them were really good. Scanners by David Cronenberg, The Howling from Joe Dante and John Sayles, Phantasm, mind blowers like George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. It's like we were in a revolution in the genre, pushing the envelope. And in fiction, I mean, I remember one week where every single book on the New York Times paperback bestseller list was a Stephen King book.
Wow.
Horror had gone mainstream. And yet in comics, there was nothing like what David Cronenberg was doing. There was nothing like what Stephen King and Dean Koontz and Ramsey Campbell and Clive Barker were doing, right? And Taboo was our attempt to get there. And we were all aware of it. I mean, Alan Moore met Clive Barker before the first Books of Blood came out. And Alan was mailing John Tolliban and I those Sphere paperbacks as they came out on the stands in the UK of the Books and Blood 1 through 6, because they came out incrementally, book one first and so on. So we were all talking about it. What I didn't understand fully is that neither Alan or John were that in love with horror. I mean, once John and I left the art chores and Rick Beach was on Swamp Thing, Rick loves science fiction and fantasy. Rick's work, often horrific as it is, he's not into horror. And Alan had done all he wanted to do at that point with that element of the character. And Swamp Thing shifted gears, as is right and proper, into more of a speculative science fictional comic. And same with John. John ended up, I mean, at a certain point in Taboo, John and I were co-editing originally, and then John didn't enjoy editing. He didn't like reading a lot of other people's shit. And he certainly didn't like dealing with what publishers and editors, unceremoniously called the slush pile, which is all the stuff that unsolicited work that comes in. I really enjoyed it. And so John, John's lifeblood at that point was collaborating with Alan on Miracle Man. Which certainly had a very, very, very strong horror component, but that's not what it was. It was about much more than that, and much less than that, as well, because I think horror is capable of everything. So I was the one that really, I so felt the success that we tasted with Swamp Thing that I felt the need to really try to push the genre in comics into up to the next level. And the cutting edge horror work I was seeing in comics in America was not appearing in the so-called horror comics. It was appearing in Raw, the Art Spiegelman, Francois Moulet anthology. Artists like Charles Burns, they were doing the cutting edge work, and nobody was publishing it under the imprimatur of a horror comic. Nobody was publishing S. Clay Wilson anymore. S. Clay had become too too obscene for the undergrounds. There were no more underground publishers, and nobody would touch it. So
Right.
taboo became, okay, how do we embrace that and, you know, open up a welcoming spot for everybody to do the most disturbing work they want to do in comics.
I want to continue on horror in a second, but I just want to ask one quick what if question. And that would be, what if prior to Swamp Thing, DC or Marvel came to you and said, hey, we'd love you, move you on to Flash. We'd love to move you on to Avengers West Coast. We want to put you on a superhero book. Where is your career if that choice was given to you, and would you have taken it?
The choice was given to me, and I did not take it.
Okay.
Ralph Macchio, I knew Ralph Macchio when he was an assistant editor for Rick Marshall up at Marvel in '77. I think is when I first met Ralph. And Ralph and I always got along. He really liked my work. When Rick Marshall was unceremoniously let go of by Marvel, Ralph, you know, stepped up into editorial duties. And when we were working on Swamp Thing, John, Tolobin, Rick, Alan, myself, I got a phone call from Ralph. And the way it was phrased, this isn't word for word, Oren, but it was pretty much, when are you going to leave the ghetto and start working for us again, right? Because Marvel really was, you know, top dog sales. Yeah. Watchmen hadn't quite happened yet. You know, Dark Knight Returns had not happened yet. And, you know, X-Men was beating the living snot out of everybody in terms of sales in American comic books. So Ralph wanted me to work on Daredevil, and I believe it was a script by Ann Nocenti. Okay. Not a script, a plot by Ann Nocenti that I was sent. And, you know, I don't like superheroes, right? When I was 3, this is how basic it is. When I was 3, I could believe King Kong. I couldn't believe Batman, right? I could believe a 50 or 70-foot giant gorilla going nuts in a city, but a guy putting a suit on to fight crime was just the
too much
silliest thing this little 3-year-old who loves silly things had ever heard of, right? So, and I never really, I got to do my Batman comic when I scripted one of the Swamp Thing annuals. And it was fun doing Batman, you know. But I didn't draw it. And I didn't really want to draw it. John had already done a fantastic Batman with the Swamp Thing annual that Alan Moore had scripted, the double size that Alan Moore had scripted. So, but so I got the plot from Ann Nocenti, and Ann, I love you. I love your work. This is not to dish you. There was a point in the script where Black Widow had her arm broken by the villain. And in the plot, it was presented that Daredevil decided that Black Widow had to keep fighting to prove herself. And I can't believe in that, right? I did first aid for 6 months. You know, I couldn't stay with it because I'm too chicken. I couldn't go ride on the ambulances. I'm too chicken shit, right? 1 second sucking chest wound, it was all over for me. But I didn't buy that, you know, there are these tropes of action, pulp storytelling, action movies, and it you know bleeds over into the superhero films that, you know, people go through physical trauma and they're going to prove themselves. No, you go into shock, right? Your body stops functioning. Your body says, lay the fuck down. You just broke your goddamn arm, right? And I couldn't buy that the hero of the story, Daredevil, would let his crippled partner in fighting crime still fight with this superhuman villain. And I declined the job. I just said, Ralph, I can't do this. And I didn't go into it with him. You know, it was very gracious, short conversation. Well, if you're ever interested, Steve, give a call, you know, but you know, that was the first shot across the bow from stepping up, so to speak, into a more visible, higher paying slot. And it was just it wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't what I wanted to do. And I can't believe in it. You know, what was the bet? You'd know better than I, Oren. Well, I've seen every one of the superhero movies as they come out. I was teaching at a cartooning school. I had to see them because the students were going to ask me about them. And what was the Batman movie with Christian Bale where he has a broken back?
Oh, that was the Dark Knight Rises, where Bane breaks his back, and
he could be paralyzed for life. Now, I had already found it ludicrous in the Batman comics when Bane broke Batman's back. Kelly Jones did a great job drawing those. I think it was Kelly Jones who drew those.
Kelly Jones, yep.
You do not mend a broken back, and you do not come back. And in the movie, Christian Bale, even he's warned by his doctor, as Bruce Wayne, like,
right,
you got a broken back. And next scene, he's jumping out a window, right? Now, Oren, right? If we pick up too heavy a box at our age, we're not only not going to be dropping out of windows, we may not be able to walk up the stairs to get to the floor, right?
That takes out a full day.
And again, this comes from a guy who can believe in, parasitic worms that, drive people into sexual frenzies in David Cronenberg films and people growing new organs and stuff. I can go with that. But, so that was my, I don't have to speculate what would happen. I was given the offer, and I read the plot I would have been drawing, and I just went, I can't believe in this long enough to make it to the thumbnails, much less pencil this issue. So I did flirt for a time. Bill Mantlo and I were going to do a Cloak and Dagger graphic novel.
Okay.
And Bill didn't really have an idea. He just knew he wanted to do one. He reached out to me, and I had the idea of Jack the Ripper coming into play, because I enjoyed the Cloak and Dagger series. Rick Leonardi, I think, was the artist of note. And I like Rick. I like his artwork. And I even got to hang out with Rick one night when he came to speak at the cartooning school. We got to go see Creature from the Black Lagoon, It Came from Outer Space, 3D double feature at Dartmouth College while Rick
Very awesome.
I guess Rick and I bonded, for at least an evening. I really like Cloak and Dagger, but it didn't go anywhere. And then Bill stole my idea and did a graphic novel of that Cloak and Dagger plot. And I didn't get credit. I didn't get paid. So that any lingering, gee, I might want to do this one day, was pretty well taken care of.
Right out the door. Yeah.
I wasn't going to play in that ballpark.
No. We're talking about horror comics in the 80s and 90s. Are independent comics the only place true horror that you love, horror that you love to draw, could have survived? Was independent books at the time?
No. In fact, I am not embarrassed to say to you that I was an Uncanny X-Men reader during Chris Claremont's run, because the Brood arc was the only horror comic appearing on the newsstands for about 6 months that year, right? In fact, Chris wrote himself into a corner. He had two storylines going. He had Dracula infecting some of the X-Men, and they had become vampires. And then he had the Brood, which was his version of Alien. There was the Brood Queen laying eggs in Wolverine and some of the other X-Men. So they had these eggs gestating inside of them. Right. And Chris wrote himself into a corner, and he ripped off a plot point from my buddy Rick Beach's Abraxas and the Earthman to get himself out of that corner. But anyway, I was, horror, when you're into a genre that goes through cycles where it vanishes almost completely, you will cling to wherever it's popping up. And it popped up in X-Men, and it popped up in New Mutants. Luckily, it was during Bill Sienkiewicz's run. So, I have held on to the Bill Sienkiewicz issues of Moon Knight, because there was that great werewolf issue that Bill did the artwork for. So, and when after Tomb of Dracula disappeared, I kept my eyes on the Marvel books, because Dracula would pop up. The companies have to keep those trademarks alive.
Yes.
So, so Dracula would pop up in Doctor Strange for 2 issues or whatever. I think I still have, I don't have it framed because I don't care that much about it, but I have in a file folder that little fake, diploma or whatever you want to call it, that Jim Shooter put out, declaring that vampires were well and truly dead forever in the Marvel universe after Dracula had been killed in Doctor Strange. And I knew that was bullshit. They were going to be dead. As soon as they had to re-up Morbius as a trademark, Morbius would be back, right?
Yeah.
So no, horror survives in all kinds of forms, and horror permeates almost every genre. Westerns, superhero books. I cavalierly mentioned earlier, but it's true. My buddy Rick Veitch doesn't like horror, but Rick has written and drawn some of the most disturbing comics I've ever read in my life, and he's drawn panels I have a hard time looking at for every period of time because they're excruciatingly painful to look at. So yeah, I mean, horror's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
everywhere. You know what? This is a gotcha question, Oren. You promised
Sure.
one, and I'll give you one. You can give me one back. Where in mainstream American pop culture for about 5 years would you have found the most original made-for-TV horror movies being broadcast?
Made for TV horror movies.
Lifetime. The movies for women. It was feature after feature about domestic abuse, sexual abuse. Some of those films were as tightly plotted and as graphic as a Johnny Craig EC Comics story, right? Because Johnny Craig, if you've read the EC Comics, I mean, he was a master of sort of film noir horror, you know, couples that are at each other's throats, whatever. And Lifetime Network, I mean, there was about, I don't watch cable, but there was when my my wife Marge and I were first getting together, she still had cable, and I would occasionally watch some of those movies. And I even started buying them when they came out on DVD because I was surprised, like, wow, these are horror movies, you know?
Right.
And some of them were quite well done and quite powerful. But people don't think of them as horror. It's the Lifetime channel. It's for women.
Right.
You know? Women love horror, man. Don't ever tell yourself anything different than that. When Martin Barker, the late great Martin Barker, not Clive Barker, no relation. Martin Barker was a British academic who wrote the definitive book on the British horror, anti-horror comics campaign of the 50s, called A Haunt of Fears. Martin told me once during one of our sit-downs, we got together for lunch and dinner a few times over the years, and Martin told me during his research into 1950s British publishers, he found a survey that one of the publishers had done. And it was one of the companies that had been reprinting the EC horror comics. And their largest readership were middle-aged married women, right? And you think about it, post-World War II, major economic depression in the UK, right? They're scraping for meat, they're scraping for staple foods. Who's bearing the brunt of that after the war when they no longer can work in the factories and enjoy paying jobs they had during the war? Women. And what's the only place that they're seeing their lives being reflected in any meaningful way? The EC horror comics, many of which were stories about husbands and wives trapped in unhappy circumstances, right? So there you go.
Is there a comic or a character that you wish you had a run on, or you wish that you had an
We wanted to do the Demon.
Yeah.
I don't even have to hesitate. Alan, John, and I pitched a Demon miniseries, and as happened with many at DC, because I'm reading, you know, these artists. I just got Dave Gibbons' autobiography that came out, Confabulations from Dark Horse, and Dave talks about he pitched a character to DC, and they said, "Oh, somebody else has that." That's what happened to us. Matt Wagner had the Demon, so we didn't get to do it. Alan, John, and I wanted to do a run on the Demon, and it was right after we had done that story arc in Swamp Thing, because it was John and I that had suggested the Demon, and yeah, I would love to have done a run on the Demon. That ship has sailed, but out of the handful of characters I enjoy drawing, you know, fan sketches for fans, Etrigan is right up there with Swamp Thing and Tyrant. I mean, I love drawing Etrigan. He's a blast. And we even had our own kind of take on it. John and I made him a bit more feline, a bit more feral. You know, we kind of added some cat aspects to Jack Kirby's design. Kirby's design of the Demon was based on, you know, most people know this that are into Kirby or the character. It was a sequence in Prince Valiant where Prince Valiant disguises himself as a demon. He pulls goose skin over his face and uses quills and feathers. And Kirby based Etrigan on that, you know, Prince Valiant disguise that only appeared like in 3 panels, you know, of Prince Valiant back in the 40s. But yeah, we would have loved to have done it. And Alan had such a great take on the Demon. I still think Alan's the only writer in comics who has written dialogue for Etrigan that flows as if a character, you know, a medieval character who would have spoken in who would have spoken in verse would speak in verse, right?
Right.
Um, a lot of writers have tried, and Alan certainly upped the game where some of the writers that came after did a bit better at it. But Alan's take on Etrigan is the only time I read the character's dialogue and it flows.
Yeah.
It sounds like Etrigan would talk like that. So
Makes sense. I just want to touch a little bit because I know we're running on time here. Teaching. How did you decide that this was a direction that you wanted to go as well as too?
like most things in life, it found me. I didn't go looking for it. I mean, I have a new career right now. I'm doing commentary tracks and bonus features for Blu-ray releases of movies I love. I've done a dozen of them already, Oren, and I mean, I'm being interviewed tomorrow for a bonus feature of a film I'm delivering the commentary track on next week. I don't go looking for the jobs; they find me.
Yeah.
I had been working in the video retail and rental industry. I left American Comics around 1998, and I formally announced I was leaving American Comics in 1999. And I worked from about 1997 until 2005 at a video superstore in southern Vermont. So I was leaving that. I left in March of 2005. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. I thought I had a freelance gig as a writer, but that fell apart. I won't go into the whole thing because time's short. And around that time, a cartoonist I'd been corresponding with in the mail, who at that time lived in the northwestern United States, I think Seattle, Portland area, James Sturm, contacted me and said, "Hey, Steve, I'm going to be in Vermont, and I'm planning on opening a cartooning school, and I'd like to meet with you." And sheer coincidence, Oren, I had already accepted an invite to a conference, an academic symposium at Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont, which was, 20-minute drive from where I lived at that time in Wilmington. And James was at that conference too. We didn't know we were going to be there, but James was there too. And I delivered a short version of a slide lecture I had been delivering for almost a decade by that point, called Journeys into Fear. It was a history of horror comics. And I had short versions, like a half hour, 40 minutes in length. I had long versions. I once did it as a 3-day presentation as an interim class at a college. James saw the short version, 45 minutes with 15 minutes Q&A. And after I got off the stage, James said, "You're just the person I need." And he brought me up to his room and he showed me all the artwork that Seth had done for the first brochures for the Center for Cartoon Studies. So I knew it was real. Like, they were really doing this. It wasn't just some pie in the sky dream. Like, I had known Seth for a number of years and I loved his work. So, whoa, you got Seth to do the brochure. And James said, "I loved your lecture. You're the guy I need to teach comics history." And so we agreed to meet in White River Junction, which was a bit of a drive for me at that time. I lived in southern Vermont. White River is in central Vermont, but I knew it well. And White River was the armpit of my home state. White River had been a very depressed town for my lifetime, my entire lifetime. It was one of the most successful towns in New England in the late 19th, early 20th century, but it really fallen on hard times. So James and I met in White River, and he walked me around downtown. There were all these empty storefronts, businesses that had shut down. And he said, "We're looking at this building. We're looking at this building." And I said, when are you planning on opening? And he said, "This summer." And this was like, I don't know, March or something, right? And I just thought, no way, like, how's that going to happen? But sure enough, and I met his partner in this endeavor, an incredible woman named Michelle Ollie. James and Michelle had not taught at the same university. James had been teaching at SCAD in Georgia, and Michelle had been, I think, in Minneapolis, working at a university in Minneapolis. They joined forces, and they were going to open the school. I went up 2 or 3 times. They had settled on the building. All the physical work was being done on the building, ripping up the floors, getting it ready for classroom use. and we started teaching the summer workshops that late June, early July of 2005. And I was there right from day one. In fact, there's a photo James has of he and I carting his books from his library across the street to the new building. So I was there, right from the get-go. And you ask why I did it. I felt a debt to Joe and Muriel Cuber that I could never repay. I could never repay what they had done for me. And so many of my classmates, Rick Veach, Tom Yates, Ron Zalmi, John Tollivan, Ron Randall, Jan Dursema, Tom Mandrake, I could go on and on and on. And when James asked me if I wanted to teach, it's kind of like the question you asked me at the start of the conversation. There were three things that had happened in my life. I was no longer in the video business, so I had to figure out what I was going to do. I knew I didn't want to do comics anymore. And my kids were old enough that they were no longer teenagers. They were young adults. And I probably would not have taught if I had been invited to teach at the Cartoon Studies when my kids were still kids. But, my daughter had already moved out of the house. My daughter, Maya, was already out living on her own with a partner. Our son, Daniel, was still living with us. Danny was still living with us, but he was about to rent his own apartment that he was sharing with a friend. So, empty nest syndrome hadn't kicked in yet, but I went, I have the emotional capacity to do this now. Like, I could work with a new young group each year, and I could fully give what I needed to give, which is, 150% is what I try to give every time on any given job. So the timing was right. And what James and Michelle were proposing was not a trade school like the Kubert School had been. We were being groomed to work for DC and Marvel. I mean, that's what the Kubert School was a trade school preparing us to work as professionals in a marketplace. The Center for Cartoon Studies was of a new generation. I call it the Fantagraphics generation, although you could also call it the Drawn and Quarterly generation or what have you. I was going to be working with young people who, like my own kids, had grown up reading Dave McKean's Cages, had grown up reading Mouse by Art Spiegelman.
Yeah.
They hadn't grown up with the comics that you and I grew up with, certainly not the ones I grew up with, right? The term graphic novel didn't exist when I was at Kubert School. And yet my kids and the students I'd be working with at the Center for Cartoon Studies, they'd grown up reading true graphic novels. And so the school was designed to teach how to make graphic novels. And yes, the goal is that our students will, find a path that will earn them a living. But unlike the Kubert School, it was not about job placement. It was not about teaching the skills so other pairs of hands can use you. It was about teaching a generation that have their own stories to tell, right? They don't want to. I had very few students who had any interest in drawing Batman or Wonder Woman or Spider-Man. I had many classmates at the Kubert School where that was the be-all and end-all. That's what they wanted to do. I was working with students who wanted to tell their story, right? And whether their story was going to be American Splendor or Persepolis or, choose your memoir or as a role model, or whether it would be something very different from anything that had existed before, that was the impetus, was to create, not to find jobs.
Gotcha.
So I was fully invested. I was like, yeah, I can do this. And along with having kids, working as a teacher was one of the 2 or 3 greatest adventures of my life. And awesome. I really, really, really miss it. And I really, really love doing it. But I really like not being responsible for whether people are going to graduate or not. And I am quite enjoying this new freelance arc I find myself in. I never would have done it. I wouldn't have pursued what I'm doing now were I still teaching. So
makes sense. Well, sir, I just want to say, first off, thank you for taking the time to speak to me. And second off, thank you so much for all the art that you've given us comic fans and the stories and all that you've given us. It's enriched our lives, and we owe you a debt also for all that you've done for us. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and I will leave you with this. I have been invited to work on a collaborative graphic novel that's in progress.
Oh,
It's going to be a couple of years, maybe as much as 3 years in the making. But I was invited by my friend John Jennings,
mhm.
who has an imprint at Abrams Books, and a creative partner in this endeavor. We're doing the fantasist and novelist Mallow Hopkinson.
Okay.
The three of us are collaborating on a graphic novel called Night Comes Walking. And so hopefully I'll be putting some more bizarre pictures and ideas in your head, Oren.
We'd be happy to see.
I do hope to get back to Tyrant, but
Mhm.
this project with John and Mallow is very real, and we've been contracted, and Mallow has delivered the first draft script and is about to deliver the second draft script, and it's a full 200 plus pages that I'll be doing with John. John and Jennings and I are collaborating on the artwork. I'm working old school,
Mhm.
doing what I did on Swamp Thing, really, layouts and pencils. And John, who works digitally, is going to be doing all the finished artwork. And I'm really looking forward to it. Anytime you collaborate with creative people,
It's a good thing.
it's something that none of you would have done alone. And this new collective entity sort of makes this thing happen. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the hell it looks like and what the hell it reads.
And we are back. I have to say, Stephen Bissette is one of the best storytellers we've had so far on the show. Wonderful, wonderful tales. His career is absolutely astounding, and you can hear how much he loves comics and still very active in comics. Just somebody who lives and breathes the art of it all. And that's so, so wonderful to hear and so wonderful to see. So thank you so much, Stephen, for taking the time to talk to us. We'd love to speak to you again. As I said before, please check out his website. And if you like what you hear today, please like, subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends. Please, we want to make this thing grow. We need your help doing it. So if you can just let folks know, pass it along, we appreciate it. All right, everyone, have a wonderful Wednesday, and I will see you soon.